Welcome to AE911Truth Webinars. This is Richard Gage, architect and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Want to thank you for coming to week 3 of this month's webinar, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, the Architecture of Destruction, where we will focus on the Twin Towers. Yes, weeks 1 and 2 we had discussed the World Trade Center Building 7, the third worst structural failure in modern history. And that is indeed something that most architects and engineers even know nothing about. And so it is an extraordinary adventure, and I encourage everyone to look at the archive on our website, AE911Truth.org. If you're not already there, if you are there, look down below at the archives and make sure you avail yourself of this particular webinar series. Also, the 15-minute documentary we've made on World Trade Center Building 7, narrated by Ed Asner. You can just go to architects-engineers.org. And before I go any further, let me introduce you to our operations coordinator who will be assisting all of us today, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hey, everybody. Happy to be with you again this Thursday, talk about this important material. Just want to remind everyone, as I always do, that YouTube automatically defaults to a low resolution for some reason. So to boost the resolution, you just click the gearbox beneath the screen and you'll see the pictures more clearly. Also, we will be taking questions about the material presented in today's webinar. You can submit your questions by typing them into the box at AE911Truth.org/webinars and type them in the box and we will take them. That's it. Back to you, Richard.
Great. And Andy will be helping us later ask and hopefully answer to some questions. We found that we don't have all the answers to the mystery of how these 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers came down on 9/11. And so all of us help each other. I have limited background myself. I have worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the architecture firm that I worked for in the San Francisco Bay Area, until I became so busy with educating other architects, engineers, building professionals, media professionals, elected representatives, and the public alike. It just kind of took over my life, and that's what's needed right now, for people to become aware. And so I was working at the time on this $125 million high school. Actually, this was just before I became aware, after hearing this very disturbing radio program on KPFA's Guns and Butter with Bonnie Faulkner, who was interviewing David Ray Griffin on that day in May of 2006. And he was talking about the evidence that we're going to be looking at today, the explosive testimony of the destruction of the Twin Towers. And I was very, very disturbed. And at the time, I was working on this project, this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing all together, 6 blocks long of retail and 2 mid-rise structures. An extraordinary project that I ended up leaving in order to make room in my life to tell you about what concerns these 2,500 architects and engineers, now 2,700, calling for a new investigation, staking their reputation on the line. Architects and engineers, licensed or degreed, what is the problem that has caused them to support me in traveling around the world, 38 countries, to groups of 1,000 to 3,000 people, 85 American cities, at least 550 times now, telling people what's going on. Why have we been on the radio? 600 separate interviews and TV. Let's talk about it, because there's massive explosions going off in these buildings. We're going to be talking about the sudden near freefall collapse here in week 3. We'll be talking also about the high velocity lateral ejections out of the Twin Towers, the complete shattering of the steel frame down to the ground, and the midair pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete. And why this concerns you. But let's start with the basics, because some people love the Twin Towers, others hated it. Like Robert Stern, gigantic dumbness, right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world. The architect didn't feel that way, of course. Minoru Yamasaki thought that he was preserving the crowning achievement of the modern style here with the sculptural purity of forms. But look what we've done with modernism. We have exchanged beauty, in this case, the Art Deco unfolding massing of the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world at the time. What have we exchanged it for? Well, that's a debate we're not going to have today. What we are going to acknowledge is that the Empire State Building and all other high-rise had a forest of columns marching through the office planning. But what they did with the Twin Towers was to push most of the columns out to the perimeter in an exoskeleton. This is an innovation at the time by concentrating the core columns around the elevator shafts inside and creating this 3 tall by 3 vertical by 3 horizontal network of welded exterior perimeter sections inside, and the core columns, almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches at the bottom, thinning to 1/4 inch or 3/8 at the top. And in between these sets of columns spanned these lightweight steel trusses, 60 feet of open office planning, which is what was achieved here. An extraordinary engineering feat that allowed them to plan offices like they never have before. I mean, these are mammoth buildings, each floor an acre in size, and look what was achieved. This is actually quite remarkable in its day. Now, it had some drawbacks. As you can see, there's a set of marching columns all around the building. Every 3 feet 4 inches, a 14-inch square steel tube column. The ceilings were relatively low, so it did feel oppressive in that manner. But what we had here is 100,000 tons of structural steel. It's a heat sink, and any fire in these buildings, these high-rise buildings, would be quickly dissipated from its source, which is what happened, and one of the reasons why the buildings were credited with standing so long by NIST. We'll come back to that. Let's take a look first, though, at the myth that developed here very early on and how.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, Steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here we have the official story in a nutshell. And what we're going to do with that story that came right from the street itself, the first gentleman who was interviewed with the Fox News hat, having the story that engineers and architects and others have wrestled with for, well, certainly years now, but even months, months and months before they could really get a grip on how these massive structures could be destroyed so rapidly. So let's test that theory, though, that hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis, one of several, which we develop when we use the scientific method in an effort to understand what happened, and in this case, the answer to our question, how did the towers come down? We do background research. How have other towers come down? Make observations. We construct several hypotheses, all the ones that make sense. We don't focus in on our favorite one and exclude others. We test all those hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions then. If the hypothesis is corroborated by the conclusions, by the experiments, by the data, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that's been done by others. And one example, of course, is NIST's startling refusal to release the input data from their computer models, which they used to try to prove their theory about how Building 7 came down. And we saw that in the last two webinars. So we put forth submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, and we were denied. And so the stated reason was it might jeopardize public safety. Well, how can it jeopardize public safety to release to the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety when we have a mystery, when we can't make sense out of the unprecedented collapse that we saw last week of this third tower that came down by normal office fires? This could happen to any building. Well, this is just one example of non-transparency. We'll look at more today. If the hypothesis is corroborated, what do? We go back, if it's not corroborated, we go back and we construct a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the data, holds itself up against the experiments, validates all of the work that we've done. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We've had the scientific method for 100 years or so. It's our way of winnowing error from truth, fact from fiction. So let's apply it. Let's start doing some background research. Let's look at some of the investigations after 9/11 that did happen, such as the early on volunteers of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Now, one of the key components of the scientific method is objectivity. And so we want groups of individuals that are not, for instance, heavily dependent on federal contracts to give us an unbiased and peer-reviewed report. No, we didn't have that. These I'll show you that many of these volunteers worked our way through each one of these investigations on into the FEMA report, which finally had some funding, $600,000, far less than any investigation that should have that has been done. For instance, the Challenger and the Space Shuttle, the effort to determine the source of the stains on Monica Lewinsky's dress, which had 10 times the funding that we had in the end here in the all three towers put together. So the Silverstein-Weidlinger report remains not public, but in 2005, NIST, who had taken over the investigation from FEMA, and I'll show you what FEMA had determined, and we looked at last week what they determined for Building 7. They said this needs more research and investigation. They couldn't even prove their own theory of how this building came down. So we have 3 years, $20 million funding, and we'll be looking at that report from NIST in the end. But what's important up front is to notice that all the individuals who were involved in the NIST report were volunteers early on. That's not an objective series of reports. So they also helped Popular Mechanics in their insidious effort to question those who, not just question, but ridicule and with disinformation, those who question the official story about what happened to these three towers. So with the scientific method, we want to look and see how have other towers come down. Well, one of the ways we learned in the first 2 weeks of this webinar series is how have these other towers came down. We find, for instance, there are typical features of controlled demolition, and we're going to be focusing on those as well as atypical features in the Twin Towers. And this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. What did we find last week? We found there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. Number 3, demolition waves, removing column supports. That's how we get symmetry. Number 4, a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the way of any collapse. Number 5, a total dismemberment of the steel structure, is broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Number 6, minimal damage to adjacent structures, typically. Number 7, sounds and flashes heard and seen by witnesses. Number 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. Number 9, isolated explosive ejections called squibs, visible at various floors. And of course, number 10, chemical evidence of or residue of incendiaries or explosives found in the rubble piles. So if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction, and fire can't create any one of them, let alone all of them. Now, if you have additional corroborating evidence or circumstantial evidence, government documentation, experts agree, at least those experts who are not biased, who wouldn't have a strong, compelling, often financial reason to side with one theory or another. Foreknowledge of the destruction, we know way in advance whether something is the destruction of a building is a controlled demolition or not, because people know about it. It takes months and dozens of operatives, months to engineer, plan, place these explosives. Of course, this is all proof of controlled demolition. As we looked at relative to the Building 7, well, we're going to apply this to buildings 1 and 2 as well. Now, what did NIST end up suggesting? Their theory, basically, we have outrageous, raging fires And underneath this lightweight steel trusses, which caused them to bend, which caused, in their theory, the perimeter columns to bend inward. And that caused the overall buckling of these columns, allowing the heavier, in the case of the North Tower, 15 stories above, to then collapse onto the story below and drive the building all the way down to the ground and then destroy itself. We're going to be evaluating that theory today. Now, a sagging floor truss cannot bend a 14-inch square steel tube column, or several of them in this case, because these trusses weren't at every column. But so what does NIST do? They impose an artificial 5,000-pound lateral force on the column, forcing it to bend, buckle in their computer model. Now, this is based on the assumption that they said, well, we saw the inward bowing of these columns, so let's just create that. Well, the question is, what caused the inward bowing of those columns? And we'll be looking at that a little bit later as we begin to systematically take on these features of controlled demolition. Let's see, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts? And are there sounds and flashes heard and seen by witnesses? That's what we're going to be starting with today as we examine the oral histories of the first responders commissioned by Thomas von Essen. In October, he began recording 500 of his first responders. Now, we didn't know about this until August of 2005 because these 500 recordings were not released to the public. They were withheld by the city. The New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release them to the New York Times, who published them. Interestingly enough, this is the report, and some researchers went through, particularly Graham McQueen, finding that 118 of these firefighters are reporting explosions, sounds of explosions, seeing flashes of light, that none of which were ever appeared in the subsequent or initial reports that came out by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. Well, let's look at some of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. So they're feeling the ground shaking. They're seeing the tower sway, and then it came down. So there's this sequence of events throughout this series of quotes that is not the collapsing that's creating all of this phenomena, the ground shaking. It's the ground shaking, or whatever created that, and then the building's coming down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. This is another gentleman, independent. It felt like a train was running underneath my feet. The next thing we know, we look up, and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. It's a third ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. These are actual quotes from the record. There was an explosion in the South Tower. I kept watching, one floor under another. I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing, says this firefighter. Seemed like on television when they blow up all these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions, says this firefighter. What are they talking about? Let's take a look at the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Slowing it down half speed, is there any similarity? Do you think there's enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially, at least here in the first 4 seconds, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Looks exactly like Building 7 at this top section in the first 4 seconds. And yet NIST went straight for collapse by fire, of course, and jet plane impacts as well. Jet fuel, 90% of which burns up outside the building, according to NIST even, and the rest burning up in just 10 minutes. Almost an hour to an hour and a half later, both towers begin their collapse that these witnesses are talking about. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Let's take a look at the South Tower. On the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity, again, to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire, the basic reason for this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever, as we saw last week. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Well, let's listen to other eyewitnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right on me, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. You know, I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower rather that has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah, detonated.
Planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were covered or even mentioned in the final NIST report? None. And this is just a sampling. There are hundreds and hundreds of them. Why not? What happened to the objective reporting where all the evidence is laid out? Well, NIST says it couldn't have been an explosion because, or controlled demolition, because controlled demolitions start at the top, at the bottom of the building. And that's typically true, of course, but let's listen to Mark Loizeaux.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Well, there's a top-down controlled demolition. Mark Loizeaux is, of course, the owner of the key, or the top controlled demolition company in the country, if not the world. Well, NIST says that the upper portion above the point of jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. We're going to look at the physics of this from a very elementary manner. What happens when we drive one object into another? There's an equal and opposite reaction. This is Newton's third law of motion, an equal and opposite destructive force. The Volkswagen, of course, would be destroyed. Doesn't matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck. No. The top lightest portion of a building, and that's the very lightest structure, 3/8 inch thick steel versus 2 inch thick at the middle of the towers and solid steel at the bottom. We can't have the lightest part of a lightest object destroying another one. But we find that that's what happened. Interestingly enough, in the first 4 seconds, you can see yourself, the top portion is being destroyed. It's telescoping down on itself. Let's take another look at this from this perspective. It is being destroyed. Something is destroying that top portion. It is not left intact to destroy anything below it. Let's take a look as we start and then stop. Like a belt, like described by the first responders, all of these explosions all the way around like a belt. And start and stop. So you can see what they're talking about just right here. None of the photographs or the videos show a block destroying anything below it. In fact, it was gone in the first 4 seconds. There's nothing left after that. Something else happens after that, which we're going to talk about. It's almost like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with outward arching streamers, laterally freely flying structural steel sections trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we'll seek to understand in next week's webinar as we look at the evidence for extreme heat. Now, something else is going on here. In fact, just intuitively, if you take off your conditioned thought process brought to you by the media and government reports and conclusions, what are you looking at? A collapse or an explosion? Let's look at the South Tower. It begins to tip over slightly and then continues down. Well, it tips at 22 degrees. It's falling off of its center of gravity over the building intact below. So we have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this section that's falling off the building. How can the building complete a symmetrical destruction, like the firefighter said, like a belt all the way around the building from the 80th floor or so on down, 85th floor, in that area? Look from below. What are we looking at here at the bottom? Are we looking at a collapse where the collapse zone is 30 stories up above? Or are we looking at an advancing series of hundreds of explosions? Again, you have to set aside your preconceived, conditioned set of beliefs and actually look at the data, because this building is shattered, completely shattered from top to bottom. High order damage, according to the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Explosion and Fire Investigations. And look at the steel. These particular sections, deeply oxidized, concave on one side, convex on the other at the butt welds, which appear to have been broken by some extreme force, on the deeply reddened and oxidized sections, indicative of massive heat, as well as the noodling, if you will, of these steel beams. Well, do we have a straight down symmetrical progression, not in its own footprint, like Building 7, a classic implosion, but outside the footprint in this case, in a 12 to 1,400 foot diameter about each of the towers. The towers are only 200 feet wide, but the debris is cast laterally. We'll take a look at what might be causing that and additional evidence of that. But the Winter Gardens, for instance, 600 feet away from the North Tower, are completely or partially destroyed by all of this laterally discharged material. Look at the Twin Towers versus well beyond the boundaries of ground zero. This material is flying compared to the nice, neat pile that we see that is the destruction or implosion of World Trade Center Building 7. Let's take a look at those laterally, freely flying structural steel sections. Let's look at this other piece of evidence called squibs, or isolated explosive ejections, occurring here, and even 60 stories below the zone of destruction, coming down, marching down toward it. NIST says, well, these are puffs of air. Well, puffs of air, they're not. You can see the solids being blown out of the buildings. They're also at 200 feet per second, most of these, as clocked by physicists. And this is explosive speeds, not air pressure. And what would be producing that air pressure? We saw ourselves that the pile driver, in the case of the North Tower, the 15-story section, is destroyed in the first 4 seconds. There's no pile driver pushing down as a piston, creating such air pressure. No, these are highly focalized, pinpoint accurate violent ejections occurring in the South Tower almost simultaneously out of the left side here. Over and over again, you can see them ejected out as the South Tower is internally demolished. There's no other explanation for these. Let's look at a couple of these squibs here.
As the South Tower begins to explode, we track two squibs near the bottom of the frame. They shoot out quickly at first, then slow and merge in with the rest of the dust cloud. Using the first few data points, we see the first squib shoots out at 44.98 meters per second, or about 100 miles per hour. Doing the same for the second squib, we get a speed of 56.3 meters per second, which works out closer to 126 miles per hour.
Again, these are explosive speeds. They can't be explained by anything else. They're pulverized building materials. They're focalized ejections. How fast is this tower coming down? Well, let's take a look and at the analysis. Well, first, let's do our own experiment. Here's 4 seconds, 5, 6, compared on the right to a piece from the movie about the tightrope walker that walked between the two. Anyway, we have somewhere between 9 seconds, which is what NIST claims, which is interesting because that's actual free fall, and 16 seconds as measured by more conservatively. Either way, this is still acceleration. Let's listen to David Chandler's analysis.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First, note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building.
In fact, what that means is 90% of the resistance of the columns has been removed, allowing an acceleration. It should have decelerated as it met this resistance. The 287 columns designed 5 times stronger than they needed to be to keep this building from going anywhere. There's more steel here than glass. That's what's extraordinary about free-falling destruction. Let's look at it this way. Take a large 15-story section of this tower and hold it up over nothing at all on the right. On the left, let's put 80 stories below it that are designed to resist that load 5 times stronger than it needed to be. We pull the lever on these magical cranes at once and drop them. What happens? Well, according to NIST, they'll hit the ground basically at the same time. In other words, ignoring the structure below it, letting both of them accelerate straight down until they fall. Let's look at it from another perspective from director Massimo Mazzucco.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
Yes, these are serious questions that have been raised in peer-reviewed papers, in this case by Gregory Zulidzinski, Anthony Zambotti, Richard Johns, in the International Journal of Protective Structures. Other peer-reviewed papers have been submitted challenging the Besant theory, which the NIST theory completely relies on as backup, which was submitted just 2 days after 9/11, this detailed calculation trying to show how the upper portion destroyed the rest of the structure below and then destroyed itself. There's no other backup. There's no other analysis, as we'll see when we examine the actual NIST report for the destruction of the towers. Do we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, indeed, it appears to be completely shattered from top to bottom, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. The outside, the perimeter of this incredible set of couple of buildings. Why is there no stack of floors found? Let's take a look. It is indeed broken up into 37.5-foot lengths, 3 stories tall, the original column sizes. Do we have the lateral ejection of structural steel units? Again, the National Fire Protection Association says look for high order damage, look for freely flying structural steel sections, which is indicative of an explosion. Well, you tell me. Here's section 1, section 2, different views, freely flying, isolated from the overall structure, especially here with this section. Back 2, 3, forward 2, 3, back 2, 3, forward 2, 3. This piece is not only laterally flying with an incredible lateral ejection component, lateral force, but it's 45 degrees, indicating that there's, right at this moment, as much lateral force as there is gravity. Where did that come from? Why is there thick white smoke clouds trailing this piece? We're going to get to that next week when we look at examples of extreme heat, but there's enough energy here to eject a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there's thousands of these ejections out of the Twin Towers. And not only that, but we would be looking in a gravitational collapse for pancakes. That is to say, pancaked floors. Like we see on the right in a real gravitational or pancaking collapse, in this case in Mexico. On the left, what do we see? A 2, 3, 4-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, mangled metal. Where are the 110 floors that should be stacked up down here in some mangled fashion? They're not. And so what happened to them? Let's look at the evidence of pulverized concrete, because it's not at the bottom. The floors aren't seen there. Well, it's pulverized in midair. This is where we see the concrete, not after it's developed its gravitational potential energy and crashed at the bottom, but no, in midair. 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a fine powder, spread quickly throughout lower Manhattan in these incredible clouds of extreme heat, which we'll be looking at next week. but 100-micron particles. It's like a fine ash that spread from river to river throughout lower Manhattan, 4-inch thick or so. An incredible series of complete pulverization. The U.S. Geological Survey defines up to 30% of these dust samples as composed of powdered concrete. How does that happen? Let's listen to the governor.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there must have been about 10,000 of these file cabinets, but this is the only one that they could find, and presumably it survived because it was indeed found in the basement. What happened to 10,000 file cabinets, 110 floors, 220 acres all together in both towers of metal decking, which should have been found stacked up amidst broken up concrete, not pulverized? What happened to the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on the top of this tower, the Deutsche Bank building. 300 or 400 feet from the South Tower. Well, they didn't come from the plane that hit the South Tower because its ejections went out this way. And they couldn't have come from the people in the plane in the north that hit the North Tower because the South Tower blocked those ejections from landing anywhere on top of the Deutsche Bank building. Where did they come from? Well, there were 2,749 victims altogether, but only 300 whole bodies were found. Most of those, unfortunately, had been killed below on the street or had jumped out of the building. 20,000 pieces of bodies found, 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,000 victims still remain completely unaccounted for. They were vaporized. They're not lost or missing. They were vaporized. This is extraordinary. Look at the distribution of these body parts well beyond the perimeter of the towers. 600, 800 feet away. These body parts are found all over, well beyond the boundaries of ground of the World Trade Center site. Do you think that gravitational collapse could cause such body pulverization? Wouldn't we expect 90% of those bodies to be trapped between floors, found stacked up in some fashion at the bottom of each of these towers? Have we shown today, in terms of the explosive nature of these buildings, that the hypothesis of explosive destruction is corroborated? Do we have, so far, at least the first 8 of these 10 key features, conventional and unconventional, of explosive demolition, particularly unconventional because of the very explosive nature versus the classic implosion like we saw in World Trade Center Building 7. We'll get to numbers 9 and 10 next week, of course, when we get to week 4 in our series. But this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't explain any one of these features, let alone all of them. Have we proved beyond a reasonable doubt in your mind that we need a new investigation? If so, there's some action steps you can take. Sign the AE911Truth petition. If you're an AIA member, please support us in our resolution calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation of Building 7. If you're not an architect or engineer, you can also sign. We have plenty of, well, we have 20,000 at least other supporters. Become a member of AE911Truth. Support us as we go to the state conventions all across the country, educating the profession, as we do the mailings, as we go around speaking, as we need to be on the radio reaching thousands more, hundreds of thousands more, millions actually. It's a lot of work, and there's a few of us who have dedicated our lives really to doing just that. And so donate and support us and volunteer and help us. We need lots of support. In fact, Andy, you can help us understand why we need this kind of support and what the opportunities are.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of great things happening right now with regard to this issue and getting the word out. And a lot of that is because of the efforts of our great volunteers helping us behind the scenes, getting the information that we need and helping some of our outreach efforts happen. So if you are passionate about this issue, you realize that this is a big deal and more people need to hear about it. We need your help. So to volunteer, just go to the top of AE911Truth.org, click the What You Can Do tab and hit volunteer. Just fill out a short application, send it to us, and we will be in touch with you. Back to you, Richard.
That is great, Andy. And thanks so much, because I can't tell you, we could not do this without all the volunteers that we have, but we still don't have enough. And he's got so many tasks for you. But you know what? Just being at home after you inform yourself of the rest of this evidence, which you may just be new to today, you're going to want to also inform and put pressure on the elected representatives, because nothing will happen without massive public pressure. We have given our DVD, which I'm going to actually screen for you, the trailer of in just a minute, to every member of Congress. We've given it to them. We've taken it into their office twice. Once when we had 1,000 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation, and again when we had 2,000. When we get to 3,000, we'll do it again. You can write your newspaper letters to the editor. You can write television, radio. Tell everyone you know. Send the AE911Truth.org link. That's AE911Truth.org to every architect and engineer that you can find and everyone else that you know. Screen our DVDs. Share these resources, brochures. Wear a t-shirt if that's what you're motivated to do to raise attention to this issue. Let people come to you and say, what's that about? And oh, I heard something about that. What's going on with that third tower? Whatever it is, you can also download for free the 48-page Beyond Misinformation booklet that we have put together, which not only pulls the rug out from the key components of the NIST report about all three towers, but provides the missing evidence that they completely ignored, that you've begun to see here in this 4-part webinar series, this being the 3rd part. You can download this and email it to all of those sources, all of your friends, and say, hey, there's 2,500 architects and engineers, 2,700 now, calling for a new investigation. What do you think about this? You know, what's going on here? They seem to be talking about science and not conspiracy theories, but this is actual science. So, you know, use AE911Truth, use our 2,700 dedicated technical and building professionals to do your job for you. That's why we're here. And 40 of those have put their testimony on the record. 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, laying out all the evidence in this 90-minute DVD, which you can get on YouTube. You can watch the 1-hour version for free, and the 90-minute version is available in our store. I'll show you how, but watch.
We don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them that can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Well, you can imagine an hour or an hour and a half of this powerful testimony. Yes, we erected a third beam on the 10th anniversary, 2010, 2011, and that was for Building 7. And that was quite a piece of ground street level action, which was extraordinary. Some of the media picked it up. What's that third beam doing in the sky? You know, well, we have made other films, really important ones. This one, Firefighters, Architects, and Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. We had a 70-city tour earlier this year around the country with Eric Lawyer featured in this film, the founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity, in which he exposes all of the flagrant violations of handling of evidence of fire and explosion investigations that NIST completely obfuscated, ignored, didn't comply with at all. And this is an amazing amazing piece you have to avail yourself of. Just search on YouTube, you'll find it there, the hour version. The hour and a half version is even better, of course, and more complete, and it's available at our store, AE911Truth.org, under What Can You Do? So we've been looking today at the evidence of explosions in week 3. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the evidence of extreme heat, including these pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron at the base of the towers. Afterward, iron microspheres, previously molten iron, billions of them in all the dust samples, documented by official sources but completely unexplained. Evidence of thermite and even nanothermite, a very high-tech incendiary, documented, peer-reviewed in papers. We'll get to that next week. This week, we have raised enough questions, I think, Andy, haven't we? For hopefully we have some from our listeners.
We do. We have 2 questions today. The first one says, I usually hear the people defending the official story say that the fireproofing was knocked off the steel when the airplanes hit it, and because they were exposed, the fire was able to weaken it. What's your answer to that?
Well, we certainly had airplanes hitting the buildings. That certainly would have caused damage associated with impact. NIST claims that it knocked off the fireproofing, particularly on the lightweight steel trusses that we looked at earlier today. And that made them more vulnerable to the fires. So we don't argue at all about that, even though the so-called proof that NIST provided in tests where they took a shotgun and shot off fireproofing, and even then it didn't really come off. But they used that as proof, and we're going to give that to them. We're going to give them, in fact, the 1800 degree Fahrenheit fires that they somehow claim were involved under these lightweight steel trusses, even though there's no evidence for fires of that heat. In fact, they themselves, in another part of their report, claim that there were no fires over 500 or 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is to say, there's no evidence that steel temperatures reached those temperatures. So without such evidence, all they have is these claims, and we're going to give them that and more, because we're not arguing with NIST or fire protection engineers or structural engineers how hot the fires were or weren't, how the fireproofing survived or didn't, how the sprinklers did or didn't affect the fires. We are focusing on the evidence for the explosive controlled demolition. In the case of the Twin Towers, it wasn't that controlled, of course, as we saw today. That is the evidence that's on the table for debate. We're not going to get sidetracked into what fires can or can't do to steel. We're just not, we don't need to go there. We have incontrovertible evidence for the explosive demolition of these towers. So why engage in any other argument?
Okay, our next question asks, many people reported explosions on 9/11. Is it true these explosions were taking place before the collapse happened? And if so, is the idea that they were removing critical components of the buildings before bringing the whole things down?
There were indeed many witnesses and visual evidence in photographs of explosions before the towers came down, and even before the planes hit them. In the case of the witnesses in the basement, including Willie Rodriguez, who says documents an explosion below. The first explosion was below the floor in the basement that he was on, and you can Google Willie Rodriguez explosions in basement, and it comes right up. I don't have evidence for that. I think it's very likely. I think his evidence is very credible, which is extraordinary, because it would indicate to me that because we know there's evidence of explosions after the planes hit the towers. I mean, at the onset of the destruction of these towers, as we've seen so many witnesses of. It does not surprise me whatsoever that there are witnesses that have evidence or experience of explosions before the planes hit, and it could be in a deceptive controlled demolition, like these three that we've been studying here in this webinar series, or that the perpetrators might want to take out the fire sprinklers, for instance, which would require a sabotaging of the fire sprinkler mains in the basement prior to the fires even getting started, so that they can't be put out. This is just speculation, but we have to kind of think our way through this, even without adequate evidence sometimes. But you noticed that is not a piece, that's not what we call evidence, and that's why it's not in our presentation. As far as removing critical components of the building at the base, I don't believe, looking at what appears to be an intention to bring these buildings down from the point of jet plane impacts down, that they would have wanted to sacrifice tipping the building over through damage to structure by removing components down below. That appears to be completely an unnecessary risk. So that's my thought. Andy, do you have any other thoughts about this question?
Sure. Well, they don't say anything about down below. I think the main crux to this question is because you had that gap of time between when the airplanes hit the buildings and then when the buildings actually came down, where people were watching them smoke for a little while. And during some of this time, the first responders and others were reporting explosions. So I think they're asking if there were certain features, or why would there be explosions going off during that time period if the buildings weren't actually coming down yet. So was there any kind of preliminary work being done?
Good point. You got it. And for instance, in the lobby, there were massive explosions well after the planes hit. And firefighters are being blown around in the building, and certainly in the lobby, in that time period between the impacts and the eventual building collapse or destruction. So it could easily be that certain features of the buildings, particularly up above, may have had to have been taken out, but we don't see a whole lot of examples of that from the exterior in the videos. There certainly is some example. There's one video of a person being blown out of one of the windows, not running out, but being blown out with a whole lot of debris. in tow. That is an extraordinary little piece, but we don't have enough to, establish a strong theory about that. So we focus on the massive, overwhelming evidence of explosions at the onset of the destruction of each of the towers. And of course, Building 7, where we have eyewitnesses we looked at last week, Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, the attorney for Mayor Giuliani, who went back into that building after the planes hit the Twin Towers. But before the Twin Towers came down, they're in Building 7, climbing up to the 23rd floor. Well, on their way, I don't know if they climbed. They may have actually taken an elevator at that point, but they went on their way down. They noticed they heard explosions, and then they experienced explosions. Barry Jennings said they were blown back up into the 8th floor in the stairwell because they had to come down the stairs on their way down. They got trapped in the building for, I forget how long it was, a half hour, an hour, and they're thinking they're going to die because all these explosions are going off. They said the lobby was completely decimated between the time they went into the building and the time that they were ultimately rescued. And this is an extraordinary adventure through pre-demolition explosions, which may indeed have been intended to take out the stairwells, which can provide resistance to a free fall collapse, which is, of course, what we found last week in looking at Building 7's 7-second free fall symmetrical collapse. That's completely unprecedented, of course, and this is all by normal office fires, according to NIST. So yes, certainly in the case of Building 7, I think we have dramatic evidence for some sort of, well, certainly explosions, but that could probably be associated with removal of critical components in the building.
Okay, well, that was our last question for the day. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you know people in the building trades industry who should be very interested in this topic, please share these webinars with them. We're going to be back next Thursday at the same time. And just once again, thank you for tuning in.
Yes, indeed. And next Thursday, we will be looking at the evidence for molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite, pyroclastic-like clouds, a fascinating study. And so please do join us. And in the meantime, inform yourself. Look on YouTube. And for our other videos, I mentioned 3 of them today. Go to our channel, AE911Truth, and see more. Inform yourself and inform everybody else. This is indeed startling, striking, overwhelming, compelling evidence for the explosive demolition of the towers, which completely undermines the official story. And what does that do? That raises all kinds of questions that we as American citizens have to wrestle with. No, we don't want to go back to 9/11. It's painful. No, we don't want to imagine the possibility that this evidence implies, which is some sort of an inside operation. After all, we don't believe, this is speculation, but it's unlikely, for instance, that Al-Qaeda terrorists could have fooled the security at the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. These are terrorist targets. They have very high security. So we need an examination of the security company who had security at these 3 buildings, as well as the airports, by the way, that the planes took off from. And we've got to have an examination of the elevator company who came in to perform the largest elevator modernization in history, the 9 months prior to 9/11. And so this takes massive pressure internally in ourselves, because again, we have resistance to wanting to look at the implications of this evidence. But we have to create pressure on our elected representatives and the media. And indeed, all Americans need pressure. I needed it myself 10 years ago when I first became aware of this evidence. And there it was, just pressing in upon me. And finally I realized, God, I have to do something. Well, I'm an architect. These are buildings. Where are the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth? They had the lawyers for 9/11 Truth. They had the scholars for 9/11 Truth. They had pilots for 9/11 Truth. All this whole 9/11 Truth movement had millions of people in it already. But so I knew what we had to do. We had to assemble the evidence. And I first took it, of course, to the architects and engineers that I worked with, 14 of them in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. They all thought I was nuts actually before. But when I bought them pizza, I brought them into the conference room, I showed them the evidence, they all ended up agreeing with me. And we had our first 15 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now we have 2,700. Let's keep the momentum going, because don't you think that your friends, your family, your colleagues have a right to know about this evidence? Who are you to withhold this evidence from those who have the right to know about it? That's puts a pressure upon you personally as an incumbent of this information to get it out. And we've got the resources for you to do just that. And we will continue next week with week 4. So invite your friends back and share the archive of all weeks that you'll find the links for on our website. Thanks again so much, and we will connect with you next week.